Hello, welcome folks, and I hope you enjoyed the panel from the last session. I caught a part of it, and it was pretty cool to hear automotive kind of things happening there. And so I would like to introduce our next talk, which is the UXL Security Strategy as an Adoption of Best Industry Practices by Roman Zukov. I will now turn the session over to him.
Hello, hi everybody, welcome. I'm so excited to be here. And my name is Roman Zukov, and I'm security champion for UXL. I'm from Intel, but serve as a security champion for UXL Foundation. And today we're going to be talking about the best development practices. And security as part of these best development practices, we are going to reveal some of the trends that are happening in the intersection between security and open source. And of course, I will leave you with some good examples, links, and good practices to follow for your developers. All right, let's get started. So, open source is everywhere. I think that is not a secret anymore. And we have heard a lot of talks about UXL, about open source in general over this conference, and this is great. Open source in numbers, I have founded the two numbers for you. This is based on which source you prefer. Synopsys tells that 96% of codebases now is the open source, right? And Linux Foundation says that from 70 to 90% of all software is open source nowadays. But there is no question that open source is everywhere and is foundational for all the products that we have nowadays. I have a little bit more numbers for you, and this paper revealed by Harvard Business School tells us that without open source software, businesses would spend over $8 trillion for developing their products. So that's just massive. That's just insane. And of course, we can't imagine the world without open source today. I do have a lot of pictures, and this is one of my favorite ones. This is pretty much well-known pictures, right? All modern infrastructure dependent on the open source, and the open source software, of course, comes from different quality, dependent on the maintainers and etc. And we will be talking about that a little bit more. So, and imagine if everybody is dependent on this little project that is maintained by one maintainer who is really tired. And that's exactly that we had as an industry in the past few years with the major incidents like Log4j, critical vulnerability zlib, and others. I think the most recent example of what's happening in the industry is this story that happened actually this year. Imagine April 2024. XZ Utils is extremely popular open source compression tool with thousands of downloads that is included to the many Linux distributions. Malicious code containing backdoor was discovered in upstream tarballs of this utility. The issue was detected relatively quickly, by the way, but get pushed to the popular distributions like Fedora, Debian, SUSE, and others. And yes, that was a major wake up for industry. I think the biggest one after the Log4j a couple of years ago, but still it's a big problem. And we're all here, so it's our open source. Now a couple of more fancy stories about open source and security. By the Sonotype told us that 1 in 8 open source downloads have known risks based on their report, 2024 report. And another cybersecurity company, Synopsys, says that 84% of codebases contained at least one open source vulnerability. That's just massive, and it's all in the enterprises. So in UXL and in Linux Foundation and across all the open source repos, we should pay the maximum attention to it, as our products are actually adopted across the industry. Now, Hugging Face, I think this is the go-to marketplace right now for the downloading those open source models and play with it. Tell me if you are not playing using the Hugging Face resources. In March 2024, this fancy name, totally harmless model, it's an open source LM model published at Hugging Face marketplace. While one of the binary files present in the data folder of the model consists legitimate machine learning data, the Python include pickle file that launches potentially malicious workload in it. Right? Pay attention to this pickle file, and it could lead to arbitrary code execution that was demonstrated by proof of concept by launching browser with the workload. It could be happens with every organization, to be honest. And this is kind of our open source, our world in what we live. Another example is this tool. I don't want to harm any single tool. It's just a random example. That's AutoGPT is extremely popular, built and use AI agents, open source tool, lives in GitHub and have a lot of stars, a lot of downloads and etc. Probably adopted by a number of enthusiasts and companies. But in fact, regardless of all these stars, this tool had poor OpenSSF score, which is 3.7, which is way below the golden industry standard. We will be talking about open source scorecard, what does that mean, and how it can help you, and how it helps us at UXL to keep our projects secure. If you think that nobody talks about security, nobody cares, and it's only like these fancy stories about this malicious stuff in the open source. No, actually, it's security and trust as the overall topic is on top of the minds. And this is a kind of screenshot from the latest open source summit, which were happening in Vienna last month. And a general manager of Linux Foundation Europe talks about the trust as a key point for open source in general, and for Linux Foundation in particular as a crucial element, right? And actually, this trust topic and security is one of the domains of the trust, is very, very important. It goes across all the domains that you can see on this slide. So everybody talks about trust, but that's us, right? What about others? What about maintainers? What about customers? Are they talk about security? Do they really care about that? Actually, they do. And even when Gabriel Columbro in his keynote featured UXL Foundation at the stage in Vienna, talked about trust and our kind of achievement as the foundation, building up the greatest and the top quality acceleration libraries here. I can show you a bit more statistics. For example, this study that you can click and download if you would like was conducted by Linux Foundation, and it turns out 72% of maintainers and core contributors feel that open source software will be secure, right? Does that mean that it is secure? A little bit, of course, it depends, but that's an interesting number. 30% of maintainers are responsible for implementing open source software security policy. Basically, it's maintainers' job, right? It's all our job, and we kind of agree with that. 69% of open source software contributors want defined best practices, right? And finally, when we presented our foundation at the Open Source Summit in Vienna, guess what was the percentage of the questions about security when we talk generally about our libraries, about our customer use cases, about our kind of performance and open source and interoperability? a huge amount of questions about, okay, can I trust this library? What about security? And tell me more about your reference implementation, whether it's secure or not. So customers do care, consumers do care. That's why here at UXL and generally as an open source community, we have to make sure we do our best to build our software and make our contributions secure. And yeah, consumers expect from open source software what they actually expect. By consumers, as I mentioned in my very first slide, by consumers we mean literally everybody. It could be enterprises, it could be startups, it could be even enthusiasts. But if it comes to the companies, I think from mid to large, what they expect from all the software, including open source. Of course, they tend to follow the best practices. I can tell you or reveal some examples about these best practices. Open Source Security Foundation, which is also part of the Linux Foundation, as well as UXL, does a great work promoting best security practices for open source and tools. And I will tell you more about some of them. There are also a couple of great frameworks that everybody looks at, like S2C2F or WASP Product Security Capability Framework, which is relatively new in our field. What else consumers expect from open source software? They expect us as an open source to be compliant with other frameworks like NIST, for example, Secure Software Development Framework, or CISA recommendations, or CIS, and others like standards and frameworks. Also, all of these companies that consume open source, meaning us, they want open source software tied well into the company governance that they all build in their companies based on their relative and respective framework that they implement in their organizations, whether it's again NIST frameworks or ENISA frameworks or cloud frameworks or OWASP or others. So when they consume open source libraries and include them into their infrastructure, into the products, they assume that should be at the top quality so that they are secure. So they rely on the open source. Actually, pretty much at the same scale as they rely at the commercial software. Often the case, they even ask, are you compliant with this open source software? And I personally was engaged in a couple of projects when we certified open source libraries, because customers actually expect this work to be done, even in open source software, non-commercial software. And that I expect as also a customer working for Intel. I personally consume a lot of open source software, and of course our requirements for open source software are very much high. So that from UXL perspective, from open source community and foundation perspective, we have no choice but implement the best practices that are expected by our consumers. Now, a few more examples. That's a good picture, represents that there are millions of packages out there in the GitHub, GitLab, and other repositories as an open source, dozens of maintainers, but you can see in this picture, a lot of them actually have quite a few maintainers, right? Often 1, 2, 3, 5, maybe 10, but they rarely more, right? I mean, active maintainers. And that could be a big problem in terms of taking care of the security and quality overall of the open source software. Now, pretend ourselves as an open source contributors, like me as a developer, or you as a developer, or others, maintainers of the open source software. They look pretty much as the picture, doing all of these pull requests, doing all of these CI/CD integrations and testings, and reviewing all of these issues and RFCs and etc., and building up the code and so on and so forth, and deploying stuff, right, and releasing stuff. And security, guys, especially in the enterprises, inside the companies, They say, hey guys, I'm doing a good job. Why I see this CV or security issue or another problem in your software? Of course, we don't want our maintainers to be, like in this position. Because what open source software actually means for a developer, right? For a contributor. Imagine at the UXL as well as in the broader open source community, where kind of all maintainers and developers, we're here to have fun contributing to open source, isn't it? We're here to explore new problems and brainstorm solutions, as well as collaborate with like-minded people and be proud of the work that is visible for all. That's why we're so passionate for open source. That's why we continue to maintain all of these libraries as a community. And of course, we would like to use native tools that's supportive but not blocking, non-restrictive. That's from the maintainer's perspective. And that's why we are doing our UXL security strategy, having all of that in mind. All of that, I mean, both the industry trends, issues, and vulnerabilities that we have out there, and development mindset, and their kind of passion to the open source. The least thing that we want to do is to cut this passion and say, hey, now we are in this picture, right? So this is the last thing that we want to do for our maintainers in the open source. Now, you probably better understand how we came to our UXL security strategy approach and what we do for our projects. Over the sessions yesterday and today, you've heard a lot about UXL projects that of course, our community is continually growing, and we're so excited to have the new projects onboarded. And with our security approach, we wanted to have the best practices from the project itself that are joining UXL. Quite obviously, they're not like a junior project, right? We are going to have the community practices in mind. We're going to have continuous input from our contributors, because often the case, we have the smartest, and actually this is always the case, we have the smartest contributors, and we have a lot of companies behind these projects that have their own practices in mind, so that we can combine and blend all of these practices and come up with developer-centric security approach, transparent, and most importantly, in the open. So that's our kind of security posture and how we approach security. We don't approach it from the specific tool perspective. We don't approach it from the legislation perspective or restrictive perspective. We approach it from the project best, community best, all of this experience from the contributors to make it developer-centric. Now, how we do it specifically. Our operating model, let me remind you that UXL Foundation operates with these main building blocks, how we do things, how we execute. Here in UXL, we have technical steering committee, we have special interest group, we have, as I mentioned, open source projects that's onboarding, and we have several working groups that you have heard already from some of them, and the good improvements that they've been doing. Our security is a work package which is included to the open source working group, and we have, of course, all these regular meetings, all of these engagements. We have the Slack channel, we have periodic reports, and we include also our roadmap and our improvements into the monthly reports of the UXL. It's all open, it's all available. You can follow the link and find us under the GitHub and UXL Foundation organization out there. What's in scope for our security effort? There are 4 key pillars that are in scope and that we improve and execute. This is our security team, which consists of the project reps from all of the projects that we currently have in UXL. We are focusing on the vulnerability response as a team. We are focusing on the secure development practices to promote them, to make sure all the projects implement the good, the best, most convenient security development practices. And of course, we do implement DevSecOps and tools and provide recommendations for the maintainers and for the projects how to use the best tools available. Of course, you are free to join, and actually you're very welcome to join. I will mention it a couple of times during my talk. Let's please join our security working group so that we get your perspective, we get your valuable input to our efforts, to our roadmaps and our plans. Now I'm going to show you our DevOps workflow. It's the vision. For some projects, we already have this in place, but for long term, we are going to have this DevOps and subsequently DevSecOps workflow so that we are transparent, as I mentioned, developer-centric, and do all of our work in the open. To better understand how it's all going to work, this is the simple diagram for you. Imagine that this is the UXL project engineer or maintainer or external contributor. For example, you guys wanted to contribute one of our projects. Probably once you come up with the code that you wanted to contribute, you wanted to run tests, right? You wanted to execute some tests, some scans, and etc. in order to make sure that your kind of contribution is good and passes all the validation. In order to do that, you submit a pull request to our to respective UXL project, whether it would be one DNN or one DAL or one MKL, you name it. Then we project that there's going to be a UXL infrastructure in place that consists of the UXL CI underlying infrastructure, and some jobs are going to run there. And also that's going to be another option as a community infrastructure. As a contributing members to the UXL, we will be donating some infrastructure so that these pull requests could be run on this infrastructure. And most importantly, these CI results will be passed back to the projects and will be available to the contributors, to all the developers, will be transparent, will be open. So that's, I think, the crucial to have this transparency, to have these logs, to have the CI results, both for non-security topics and of course for security scans and for security testing, so that that contributor or engineer can have these results in front of him and can analyze and can figure out whether that person needs to make any tweaks to the PR, right? I think that's just natural how the pure work out in the open should be done by everybody, by any community, by any projects. Now, approaching that or keeping that grand vision in mind, we build up our security program, and I'm going to speak about that from the crawl, walk, run perspective, what we have already done and what we plan as a security efforts for the foundation and for the projects under UXL. First of all, we enabled basics. We made sure that all the projects have done the really basic hygiene in terms of security. That means we enforced multi-factor authentication for all the maintainers, for all the key people out there. We made sure that all the roles and tokens are in good shape, following the least privilege principle, right, and grained and granulated. We enabled OpenSSF essentials. I will be talking in the moment about OpenSSF scorecards and what that means and how we use it. We enabled software composition analysis code scans. We enabled secret scanning. We made vulnerability policies specific for UXL, but essentially in alignment with the open source best practices. That's what we done at the very start. What we're doing right now, and that work is almost completed as well, we are aiming to be industry golden, right? Like not even do the basics, but as I mentioned, and as previous speakers mentioned, if you're using some stuff like PyTorch, TensorFlow, and etc., you are eventually using UXL projects as well, right? That's just massive adoption across the industry, so that we can't afford ourselves to be less than industry golden. So for the industry golden, we made sure that we have OpenSSF scorecards that represents the industry best security practices for open source repos. More than 7 and even more than 7.5, which is great golden industry standard. We are going to make sure that all of the projects gained their best practice page, which I'm going to show you in a moment what that means. We are implementing static analysis scans for each languages that we use in our repos. We are going to reveal public build logs out of the security scans and other scans, non-security related. Currently, we implementing binary security composition analysis tool, which is quite a big deal because software composition analysis meaning analyzing your dependencies, understanding your dependencies and vulnerabilities. For that, quite a big deal when it comes to binaries. We also implemented linters like Bandit, for example, or ClankTidy or others, or other linters for the code smelling, for the code accuracy. And going forward, we're going to look into the fuzzing. By the way, fuzzing is already implemented by a couple of our projects. We are going to make sure that everybody implemented this good approach. Fuzzing means extensive testing for the kind of random or unexpected inputs to the different interfaces in your application, in order to make sure you don't have crashes or bad guys can't break your application in order to make some harm to confidentiality or integrity, for example. We're going to look into the sign-in releases and build provenance, which again is the good industry practices, though we have some progress for a couple of projects already here. We're going to document our security practices, like security insights, YAML files, threat models. We're going to look into the GitHub Actions hardening and automating this work. And moving forward, we're going to look into the other brilliant checks, like compiler security flags, even anti-malware scans. Believe it or not, but as I work with the open source community, often the case, I still found some malware binaries in the open source, checked in the open source repos. So that anti-malware scans for open source doesn't sound like a crazy thing, right? It's a necessary thing because bad guys are not sleeping, so they can check out some malware in the repos, and that's happening, unfortunately, nowadays. GitHub Actions linting. There are a couple of proof of concepts open source projects that we're evaluating right now as a tools for GitHub Actions linting. That's all of the amazing journey. That's probably a little bit ahead of us, but that's what we're looking for, and that's what we are doing right now. To be more specific, what we do, I mean, that was the kind of strategy and foils, and I provided you a couple of links in the middle of the presentation, like frameworks and examples and etc. that you can follow, that you can check out and even use for your own open source repos or in your organization internally. But there is a couple of specific examples. Security policy is really essential for all of the open source projects in order to make sure that we receive all of the vulnerability reports consistently and privately and in the unified way. So for all of the UXL projects, you can click the button and report a vulnerability using the GitHub interface, or you can drop your research, your concern to the security@uxlfoundation.org email, so that we are going to take care about that. Evaluate, triage, fix if necessary, and then responsibly disclose, right, that we fixed this vulnerability and everything is all right. There is a short and concise guide how to report the vulnerability. Please go ahead to any of our projects. This is one DAL in the screen as an example, but you can check it out at any of the projects and see how we handle vulnerability reporting. Now, I mentioned a couple of times security scorecards or OpenSSF scorecards, which is a brilliant tool, I think, which is also a part of Linux Foundation, but that's the tool that can show the health status in terms of security for open source repos. It contains 18 or maybe a little bit more nowadays individual checks that returns a specific score for open source repo, right? And there are grades for each score. For example, the critical risk checks are weighted at 10, highs are weighted at 7.5, and etc. And then you have the aggregated score for your repo for the metrics like code reviews, contributions, whether or not workflows are dangerous, what's the maintenance cadence, licensing, and etc. Why we implement the scorecards and why I suggest to implement OpenSSF scorecards for all the open source repos that you maintain or even would like to evaluate, because the most popular repo, as I showed you a couple of slides back in my examples, most popular doesn't mean most secure, unfortunately. This tool is open source. OpenSSF scorecard is open source. It works nicely with GitHub or GitLab repos. It represents industry best practices. But for you, you can focus on the metrics that's important for you while you evaluating open source repos. Now, this is the concrete example how we use it. For example, for one DAL, we have the decent score of 8.4. We run it automatically using the GitHub Actions. And we have these badges, right? And we utilize, you can utilize graphic user interface as I exemplify by this link, right? You can see it nicely in the interface. You can run it manually via command line. But for all of the UXL repos, you can go ahead to the repo and see this nice badge at the GitHub, like representing OpenSSF scorecard, and a couple of other badges, like, for example, OpenSSF best practices, and etc. That again means that we implement the best practices. Now, another tool that might be useful for you is the CVE bin tool. I mentioned that briefly a little bit, that in software composition analysis and SBOM world, this is quite a big deal to check your binaries for the dependencies and vulnerabilities. It's a little bit easier to check the source code, because especially if you use the package managers like PyPI or npm or whatever, it's a little bit easier to build up the dependency tree. But for binaries, it's a big deal. And I don't know a lot of the open source tools out there. There are pretty much all the commercials, but this is CVE bin tool, open source tool, free to use, that can tell you a little bit more about dependencies and vulnerabilities in the dependencies. It ingests data from different databases. It's not only NVD as the kind of default one, but also Red Hat, also open source vulnerability database, GitLab advisory database, curl vulnerability database, and it's constantly evolving by adding more data sources. And again, it's free and open source. We use it for a couple of projects, and we're going to expand it to all the projects, and you can go ahead and try this tool as well. Quite helpful as an open source tool. Other best practices that we follow is, clean code is the best friend of security, right? Do we really need all these dependencies? And that question we ask to ourselves as we maintain UXL projects, right? Overall community and repo maturity is a good metric to check when you ingest your open source, and we of course try to keep the high bar for these recommendations as well. How do you believe it's adopted? Do you have all these documentations, roadmap, test coverage, and etc.? It's a good practice to check repo maintenance health. by checking the releases, the release cadence, maintainers, how fast projects respond to the issues, PRs, and etc. And we utilize these good practices while we build up our open source software ingesting third parties. And I would suggest you guys to follow this practice as well as you consider open source libraries to ingest into your projects or infrastructure. Pay attention to vulnerability research. And they ask yourself the question, why are you linking all these binaries to your open source software instead of building from source? This is quite an interesting question. Now, finally, have a look at the moving ahead as the UXL and actually as a good guidance for all the open source practices. Have a look at the different metrics that's already out there. For example, another Linux Foundation hosted project, Chaos Metrics, can tell you more about open source project health. It's unrelated to security specifically, but can tell you about the health of the project in general. Again, that would be helpful for you if you ingest open source project into your infrastructure, into your projects, into your workflows. And we are going to look into it as the foundation, as the UXL moving forward, as we ingest in our dependencies as well, and as we are building our projects under UXL umbrella. Have a look at this security baseline initiative that's also run by OpenSSF, again, also hosted by Linux Foundation. A good set of practices for open source in general and for projects, for software development in general. Finally, I encourage everybody to take developing secure software class and check out other courses that are available in the Linux Foundation. This specific class is free for everybody, and I personally took a part contributing to this class. It's very interactive, it's very encouraging, and please populate it among your developers. It's good in general, but we also recommend it for all the maintainers and for all the potential maintainers and contributors to the UXL projects, and of course to broader community. That's all about it. Join us. We would love your inputs. We would love to hear your perspective. We'd love to hear your good practices. We would love to hear your contributions. Help us building the most trusted acceleration foundations for an AI era. I'm going to leave some contact information here. You can reach out us at security@linuxfoundation.org. You can join mailing list of the Linux Foundation. You can join our Slack channels here at UXL. You can easily find me at LinkedIn if you would like. Please contribute. Please join. Let's talk more about open source contributions and security together. All right, that's all about it.